7 Golden Age stars who loved breaking the law. When we think of Golden Age Hollywood, we picture glamour, sophistication, and the strict moral codes of the Hays office that governed what could appear on screen. But behind that carefully polished facade lurked some of the most flagrant lawbreakers in American history, stars who didn't just occasionally bend the rules, but made criminal behavior their personal hobby. These weren't just celebrities who had a minor scrape with the law or made a youthful mistake. These were Hollywood icons who treated courtrooms like their second home, jail cells like hotel rooms, and police officers like particularly annoying fans. The studios didn't just cover up criminal behavior, they budgeted for it, revealed a former MGM security chief who worked from 1943 to 1957. We had attorneys on permanent retainer, cash reserves for bribes, and staff whose only job was to keep certain stars out of prison. One executive told me, "The cost of making our biggest stars' problems disappear is just another production expense." What's most shocking isn't just what these stars did, it's how openly they flaunted their contempt for the law while studios created the illusion of wholesome American heroes and heroines. The public saw carefully constructed images of respectability, while police blotters told a completely different story. "I arrested the same major star 3 times in 1 month," recalled a retired Los Angeles police officer. "Each time, I'd get a call from the chief before my shift ended. Each time, the arrest report would mysteriously disappear, and each time, that star would be on a magazine cover the next week, portrayed as America's sweetheart. It was like living in 2 separate realities. From wild parties that destroyed entire hotel floors to violent outbursts that would have ended any normal person's career, these 7 stars didn't just break laws, they made law-breaking central to their identity, their lifestyle, and sometimes, tragically, their downfall. But before we dive into Hollywood's most notorious outlaws, we need to understand the man who made criminal behavior a Hollywood status symbol, the swashbuckler, whose real-life escapades made his on-screen adventures look tame by comparison.
Errol, the last picture in which we saw you with the sun also rises.
Errol Flynn, Hollywood's original professional outlaw. When Errol Flynn swaggered across the screen in films like Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood, audiences thrilled to his portrayal of charming rogues who lived outside the law. What they didn't know was that Flynn's real passion for law-breaking made his characters look like choir boys by comparison. Errol didn't just break laws, he collected them like trophies, said a longtime Warner Brothers security officer who dealt with Flynn's numerous legal entanglements. Bar fights, property destruction, smuggling, assault, drunk and disorderly conduct. He wasn't just reckless, he was systematic. Breaking the law wasn't something that happened when he lost control, it was his favorite recreation. Born in Tasmania, Flynn brought his contempt for authority to Hollywood, where his studio's protection and his own star power created a perfect environment for increasingly flagrant criminal behavior. What began as drunken brawls and property damage soon escalated to more serious offenses. The pattern was always the same, recalled a former Warner Brothers publicity agent. Errol would get arrested, the studio would send lawyers and fixers, money would change hands, records would disappear, and Flynn would walk away laughing, already planning his next escapade. Flynn's most notorious brushes with the law came in 1942, when he faced charges involving 2 underage girls. Though he was ultimately acquitted in a highly publicized trial, the case revealed a pattern of behavior that shocked even Hollywood insiders familiar with Flynn's wild lifestyle. During the trial, instead of laying low, he'd show up to court visibly hungover from partying the night before, remembered a courthouse reporter who covered the proceedings. His attitude wasn't remorse or concern. It was amusement, as if the whole criminal justice system was just another audience for his performances. Perhaps most revealing was Flynn's own attitude toward his lawbreaking. Unlike stars who tried to maintain respectable public images, Flynn openly incorporated his outlaw persona into his celebrity. His 1959 autobiography, My Wicked, Wicked Ways, didn't just acknowledge his criminal behavior, it celebrated it. "I was living a life of drunken debauchery," Flynn wrote, without a hint of regret. "I can't count the number of fights I've been in. I'm a trial to all who know me." Flynn's open contempt for the law extended beyond American borders. His yacht, the Sirocco, became notorious for smuggling activities, and he faced legal troubles in multiple countries. He was once arrested in Rome for fighting with police, and in Jamaica for carrying an illegal firearm. What made Flynn different from other troubled stars was his pride in breaking the law, observed a film historian who studied Flynn's career. He didn't try to hide it or apologize for it. For Errol, the mugshot was just another photo opportunity. By the time of his death in 1959 at age 50, Flynn had accumulated an arrest record longer than his filmography, and the studio had spent millions protecting their valuable star from the consequences of his actions. But while Flynn treated lawbreaking as a game, our next star faced real prison time for his criminal activities.
Named Kevin McDonald got here when there was nothing but Indians and coyotes. All worked real hard. Now that things are beginning to look up.
Robert Mitchum, the star who went to jail and came out bigger. Robert Mitchum's sleepy eyes and nonchalant demeanor projected an image of cool detachment on screen. Off-screen, that same attitude extended to his view of the law, something he regarded as entirely optional. Mitchum didn't have some psychological need to break rules, explained a film producer who worked with him in the 1950s. He just genuinely didn't believe they applied to him. Not out of arrogance exactly, but a profound indifference. The concept of legal consequences seemed theoretical to him. This attitude crashed into reality in 1948, when Mitchum was arrested in a highly publicized marijuana bust at a Hollywood party. Unlike other stars whose legal troubles were quickly buried by studio fixers, Mitchum's case became front-page news nationwide, complete with stage photographs of the actor behind bars. The arrest was a setup from the start, claimed a former Los Angeles police officer familiar with the case. Narcotics officers had been targeting Hollywood for headlines, and Mitchum was the biggest fish they caught. They made sure photographers were there to document every moment. Mitchum was sentenced to 2 years of prison time, with all but 60 days suspended, which he served at a prison farm in Castaic, California. For most stars of that era, such a public conviction and incarceration would have ended their career. For Mitchum, it only enhanced his rebel image. When he got out of jail, his popularity had actually increased, marveled a studio executive from that period. The public didn't turn against him. They embraced him more enthusiastically. It was the moment Hollywood realized scandal could actually boost a career rather than destroy it. Mitchum himself treated the entire experience with characteristic detachment. When asked if his imprisonment would damage his career, he famously replied, "It's like a big league ball player in the bush leagues. It's merely a change of scenery." But Mitchum's marijuana conviction was far from his only brush with the law. Throughout his career, he was repeatedly involved in violent altercations. In one infamous incident, he broke a man's jaw outside a restaurant after an insult. In another, he was involved in a knife fight at a bar that required police intervention. He had this philosophy about fighting, remembered a co-star who witnessed several of Mitchum's violent outbursts. He believed if someone insulted you, you had an obligation to respond physically, not out of anger, but as a matter of principle. The law's prohibition against assault simply didn't factor into his thinking. What made Mitchum particularly unusual among Hollywood lawbreakers was his honesty about his behavior. Unlike stars who relied on publicists to craft respectable images, Mitchum spoke openly about his disregard for legal constraints. "I started out in life as a juvenile delinquent," he told one interviewer, "and I've never really graduated beyond that." When asked about his time in jail, he quipped, "It was like Palm Springs without the riffraff." By the time of his death in 1997, Mitchum had compiled a legendary career spanning more than 100 films, and an equally impressive record of legal infractions that would have derailed any normal career. But while Mitchum's law-breaking eventually became part of his marketable image, our next star's criminal behavior would destroy him completely.
This dough's too thin.
Sure it's too thin.
Fatty Arbuckle, the silent star whose parties ended in tragedy. Before Charlie Chaplin, before Buster Keaton, there was Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, silent comedy's first true superstar. At the height of his fame in 1921, Arbuckle commanded an unprecedented $1 million annual salary, equivalent to over $14 million today, and was beloved by audiences worldwide for his surprisingly graceful physical comedy, despite his 266-pound frame. Behind the scenes, however, Arbuckle had established himself as Hollywood's most notorious party host, throwing events so wild and destructive that hotels throughout California began refusing his reservations. Arbuckle's parties weren't just wild, they were criminal enterprises, stated a film historian specializing in silent-era scandals. Property destruction, illegal alcohol during Prohibition, indecent exposure, and often violent behavior. Hotel rooms would be completely destroyed, furniture broken, walls damaged, fixtures torn out, and this wasn't occasional behavior, it was nearly every weekend. Paramount Pictures, which had built much of its early success on Arbuckle's popularity, maintained a special department dedicated solely to handling the legal aftermath of his parties, paying off hotel managers, bribing police officers, and settling lawsuits from injured guests. The studio had a standard procedure, explained an archivist who uncovered financial records from the period. Each Monday, Arbuckle's handler would submit reports of weekend damages, and checks would be issued to various hotels, police precincts, and injured parties. In 1 month alone in 1920, Paramount paid out over $28,000, about $400,000 in today's money, just covering up Arbuckle's destructive parties. But on Labor Day weekend in 1921, Arbuckle's law-breaking lifestyle caught up with him in a way that even studio fixers couldn't resolve. Following a 3-day party at San Francisco's St. Francis Hotel, a young actress named Virginia Rapp fell seriously ill and died days later of peritonitis caused by a ruptured bladder. Arbuckle was charged with manslaughter, with prosecutors initially claiming he had caused Rapp's injuries during an assault. The ensuing legal battle became America's first major Hollywood scandal, with sensationalistic newspaper coverage turning public opinion against the comedian. Even by today's standards, the media coverage was incredibly irresponsible, noted a legal historian who studied the case extensively. Papers printed completely fabricated details about torture devices and inhuman behavior that had no basis in evidence. But importantly, what's often overlooked is that while Arbuckle was eventually acquitted of causing Rapp's death, the party itself involved numerous illegal activities that were never disputed. After 3 trials, 2 ending in hung juries, the 3rd in acquittal, Arbuckle was legally cleared of responsibility for Rapp's death. The jury in his final trial even took the extraordinary step of issuing a written apology stating he had been the victim of a grave injustice. But Arbuckle's career was destroyed. His films were banned, his contract canceled, and his name became synonymous with Hollywood excess and criminality. Though he would eventually return to working behind the camera as a director under the pseudonym William Goodrich, his days as America's highest-paid entertainer were over. What's particularly revealing about Arbuckle's story is how quickly the studio abandoned him once his criminal behavior became too public to manage. The same executives who had for years enabled and covered up his law-breaking immediately distanced themselves when continuing to do so threatened their own interests. Paramount had been perfectly happy to handle the legal fallout of Arbuckle's behavior when it stayed relatively private, observed a biographer who wrote extensively about the comedian. They paid for the lawyers, the bribes, the settlements, all because he was making them millions. The moment that calculus changed, they not only dropped him, but actively participated in his public destruction. While Arbuckle's career-ending scandal involved tragedy but not intentional violence, our next star's lawbreaking would escalate to the most serious crime of all.
Spade told me that he owned music off of an Indian reservation.
Spade Cooley, the television star who became a murderer. In the 1950s, Donald Clyde Spade Cooley was one of America's most beloved entertainers, the king of Western swing, with a hit television show on KTLA in Los Angeles and a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. His weekly program drew an audience of 75 million viewers, making him one of the most recognizable faces in 1950s entertainment. Behind this wholesome public image lurked a man with a long history of violence, alcoholism, and increasingly dangerous criminal behavior. Cooley had been in trouble with the law for years before the public had any idea, revealed a former KTLA employee who worked on his television show. There were assaults, drunk driving incidents, property destruction, but the station and his record company had a system for making these problems disappear. They had a network of police contacts who would call them before formal charges were filed, giving them time to intervene. This pattern of escalating violence reached its horrific conclusion on April 3, 1961, when Cooley brutally murdered his wife, Ella May, in front of their 14-year-old daughter. The attack, triggered by Cooley's unfounded belief that his wife was having an affair, was so savage that investigators on the scene were visibly shaken by the evidence. This wasn't a crime of momentary passion, emphasized a detective who worked the case. Cooley tortured his wife for hours before she died. He crushed a cigarette into her skin. He beat her with a gun. He threatened their daughter, and most chillingly, he would pause the attack to take phone calls about business matters, then return to the violence. It showed a level of calculated cruelty that shocked even veteran officers. Cooley was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. What makes his case particularly significant in the context of Hollywood lawbreaking is how completely his criminal behavior had been concealed from the public despite years of escalating incidents. The television audience who invited Spade Cooley into their homes each week had no idea of his violent criminal record, noted a cultural historian specializing in early television. His sponsors, the network, his record label, they all participated in creating this fictional character of the charming, wholesome Western star while knowing full well about his violent outbursts and legal problems. Records revealed during his murder trial showed that Cooley had been arrested at least 8 times in the years preceding the murder, with charges including assault, battery, public intoxication, and making criminal threats. Each time, industry connections and financial influence had kept these incidents from becoming public knowledge. There was a very deliberate effort to maintain Cooley's marketable image despite his increasingly dangerous behavior, explained an attorney familiar with entertainment law from that period. Contracts were signed, money changed hands, records were sealed or lost, all to protect the valuable commercial property that was Spade Cooley, family entertainer. It was only when he committed a crime so heinous that it couldn't possibly be covered up that the public finally learned who he really was. Cooley died in 1969, having served 8 years of his life sentence. He had been granted temporary release to perform at a police benefit concert and suffered a fatal heart attack backstage. The irony of a convicted murderer dying while performing for law enforcement officers was not lost on those familiar with Hollywood's long history of complex relationships with legal authorities. While Cooley represents an extreme example of criminal behavior among Hollywood figures, our next entry involves a man whose entire identity was defined by his criminal connections. Johnny Stompanato, the gangster who became a Hollywood player. Johnny Stompanato wasn't a star himself, but as the boyfriend of screen legend Lana Turner, he brought organized crime directly into Hollywood's inner circle, creating one of the most dangerous and volatile situations in entertainment history. Stompanato wasn't just connected to crime, he was a professional criminal who used Hollywood as his playground, explained a former Los Angeles detective who investigated organized crime in the 1950s. He was a full-fledged member of Mickey Cohen's operation, one of the most powerful crime syndicates on the West Coast. For him, dating Lana Turner wasn't just a romantic relationship, it was a strategic alliance that gave him access and protection he couldn't have gotten otherwise. Born in Illinois and having served in the Marines during World War II, Stompanato established himself in Los Angeles as an enforcer and bodyguard for Cohen, handling debt collection, security for illegal operations, and other activities requiring intimidation and the threat of violence. His relationship with Turner, which began in 1957, immediately created problems that extended far beyond the typical celebrity romance. Stompanato's criminal behavior didn't stop when he entered Hollywood society. Instead, he brought his underworld tactics directly into the film industry's most exclusive circles. He would show up on studio lots, threatening people connected to Turner's career, recalled a production assistant who worked at MGM during that period, directors, fellow actors, makeup artists. Anyone he perceived as having too much influence over her was subject to intimidation. He once pulled a gun on a director who he felt was being too familiar with Lana during a scene rehearsal. Stompanato's violence wasn't limited to strangers. Turner herself was frequently the target of his abuse, with multiple documented incidents of physical attacks occurring at their home, in hotel rooms, and even in public places. The bruises were sometimes visible during filming, remembered a makeup artist who worked with Turner. We'd have to apply extra makeup, change lighting setups, adjust costumes to cover the evidence. Everyone knew what was happening, but no one felt they could intervene against someone with Cohen's organization behind him. The situation reached beyond Turner to affect others in Hollywood as well. When Frank Sinatra began showing interest in Turner, Stompanato reportedly confronted him at a restaurant and threatened his life, one of several incidents where his criminal background led to direct conflicts with other entertainment figures. Johnny wasn't just breaking laws here and there, emphasized a researcher who studied organized crime's influence in Hollywood. His entire presence in the entertainment world was a criminal enterprise. He was essentially operating as Cohen's representative in Hollywood, using his relationship with Turner to extort, threaten, and control people throughout the industry. This volatile situation came to a tragic end on April 4, 1958, when Turner's 14-year-old daughter, Cheryl Crane, stabbed Stompanato to death in their Beverly Hills home. Crane claimed she was defending her mother from yet another of Stompanato's violent attacks, and a coroner's inquest ruled the killing justifiable homicide. The tragedy revealed how completely Stompanato's criminal lifestyle had poisoned everything around him, noted a crime writer who covered the case extensively. Here was a teenage girl who felt so threatened, so traumatized by the constant violence and danger he brought into their home that she took the most extreme action imaginable. It showed just how dangerous the situation had become. The Stompanato case exposed the dark reality that Hollywood's glamour sometimes concealed. Not just stars who occasionally broke laws, but genuine criminals who used the entertainment industry as both cover and opportunity for their activities. While his death ended one particular threat, it also revealed how vulnerable even the most famous stars could be to criminal infiltration of their lives. While most of our law-breaking stars engaged in violent or destructive behavior, our next entry shows a different kind of criminal activity, one based not on aggression, but on desperate attempts to escape a prison-like studio system. Judy Garland, the star who broke contract law to survive. When we think of Hollywood lawbreakers, we typically picture violence, substance abuse, or destructive behavior. Judy Garland's criminal activity was different, a systematic campaign of contract violations, legal evasions, and court order defiance that she undertook as her only means of surviving a studio system that was quite literally killing her. Judy didn't break laws for thrills or out of disregard for rules, clarified an entertainment lawyer who studied her legal battles extensively. She broke them out of desperation. MGM had such complete control over every aspect of her life, including forcing dangerous combinations of uppers and downers on her from childhood, that violating her contract became her only way to assert any control over her own existence. From her earliest days at MGM, Garland was subject to contractual obligations that went far beyond normal employment relationships. The studio controlled what she ate, how she dressed, who she could date, and most dangerously, what substances she was required to take to maintain the punishing work schedule they demanded. They had her on Benzedrine to lose weight and stay energetic during 18-hour workdays, then barbiturates to force sleep, creating a cycle of addiction that began when she was still a child, explained a medical historian who researched drug use in the early film industry. By the time she was an adult, she was physically dependent on a pharmaceutical regimen that was completely controlled by the studio. As this situation became increasingly unbearable, Garland began her campaign of contract breaking, missing rehearsals, arriving late to sets, and eventually failing to appear at all. These weren't the actions of an irresponsible star, but calculated legal violations designed to create breathing room in an intolerable situation. Each absence was technically a breach of contract, a civil violation that could trigger legal penalties, noted the entertainment lawyer. But as her legal battles with MGM escalated, these contractual violations became more serious. She began deliberately violating court orders, leaving jurisdictions where legal documents had been served, and using elaborate schemes to make herself legally unreachable. One of the most dramatic examples occurred in 1950 during the filming of Royal Wedding. After being fired from the production for unreliability, itself the result of her medication issues, Garland checked into a New York hotel and made a superficial cut on her neck. While not a serious suicide attempt, the act created enough confusion and concern that she was able to effectively disappear from legal reach for several critical days while her representatives negotiated with the studio. This wasn't just contract breaking. This was elaborately planned legal evasion, emphasized a biographer who documented this period of Garland's life. She used disguises, fake names, and a network of friends to keep her whereabouts unknown to process servers and studio representatives. She was essentially a fugitive, not from criminal charges, but from civil contracts that were destroying her health and sanity. What makes Garland's case particularly significant is that her law-breaking was recognized, even by some legal authorities at the time, as a necessary response to a system that offered no legitimate means of escape. There's documentation of a California judge privately acknowledging that Garland's contract with MGM was indentured servitude in all but name, revealed a legal historian. He noted that while her violations were technically illegal, the contract itself was so exploitative that no reasonable person could be expected to comply with it. But publicly, the courts continued to side with the studio. Unlike our other entries, Garland's lawbreaking didn't involve violence or harm to others. It was instead a desperate series of attempts to break free from a system that treated her as property rather than a person. By repeatedly violating her contract, evading legal proceedings, and ignoring court orders, she eventually won a freedom that no legitimate legal channel would have provided. Every time she walked off a set, missed a performance, or hid from process servers, she was breaking the law, concluded the entertainment lawyer. But these weren't the actions of a criminal. They were the desperate measures of someone fighting a system that offered no legal path to basic human autonomy. Her greatest crime was refusing to be owned. While Garland's lawbreaking stemmed from desperate circumstances, our final star seemed to treat criminal behavior as just another form of entertainment in a chaotic, consequence-free life.
You went out and had lots of fun. I mean, you went out to parties and with girls.
Mickey Rooney, the boy next door who was Hollywood's secret menace. Mickey Rooney projected the perfect all-American image, the energetic boy next door who embodied wholesome values in the Andy Hardy series and family-friendly films that made him MGM's biggest star of the late 1930s and early 1940s. Behind this carefully crafted persona lurked one of Hollywood's most persistent lawbreakers, a man whose criminal activities were so numerous and varied that MGM maintained a special division dedicated solely to managing his legal problems. Mickey wasn't just occasionally in trouble, he was perpetually in violation of multiple laws, revealed a former MGM security officer who worked closely with the team handling Rooney's legal issues. Gambling at illegal establishments, visiting brothels, street racing, assault, property destruction, public intoxication, the list was endless. And this wasn't a brief phase, it was a consistent pattern throughout his peak years. What made Rooney's case particularly striking was the complete disconnect between his public image and private behavior. While the public saw Andy Hardy dispensing homespun wisdom and respecting authority, the real Rooney was regularly being extracted from police stations across California. There was a standard procedure when Mickey got arrested, explained the security officer. Studio security would be notified before the booking was complete. Cash would be delivered to the precinct. Records would be altered or destroyed. And Mickey would be back on set the next morning as if nothing had happened, ready to play the clean-cut American boy. This pattern of law-breaking and studio intervention created a sense of immunity that only encouraged more extreme behavior. In one notorious incident, Rooney reportedly drove his car through the front window of a Los Angeles restaurant after being denied service due to his visible intoxication. Instead of facing criminal charges for what was clearly dangerous and destructive behavior, he was back at work within hours, recalled a production assistant who witnessed the aftermath. The studio had already dispatched a team to pay off the restaurant owner, handle the police report, and ensure no charges were filed. Mickey found the whole thing hilarious, just another anecdote in a consequence-free life. Rooney's financial crimes were equally substantial. Despite being one of Hollywood's highest-paid actors, he was repeatedly sued for unpaid debts, fraudulent financial arrangements, and failure to honor financial obligations, legal violations that would have resulted in serious consequences for anyone lacking studio protection. He would sign contracts, take advances, and then simply ignore his obligations, said a business manager who dealt with several entertainers from that era. Loan agreements, performance contracts, even court-ordered payments, Mickey treated them all as optional. By the mid-1940s, there were so many judgments against him that MGM had lawyers working full-time, just managing the legal paperwork his behavior generated. Perhaps most disturbing were the allegations of inappropriate behavior toward young women on studio lots, incidents that were handled through payoffs and threats rather than proper legal channels. Multiple accounts describe Rooney engaging in unwanted advances and inappropriate comments, with studio security intervening to prevent formal complaints. The power imbalance was extreme, noted a historian who studied misconduct in early Hollywood. These were often young women just starting in the industry, suddenly faced with inappropriate behavior from MGM's biggest star. When they tried to report it, they encountered a wall of studio protection designed to keep Mickey's image clean, regardless of his actions. By the time MGM finally severed ties with Rooney in the late 1940s, the studio had spent millions managing his legal issues. But without that protection, Rooney's behavior didn't improve. Instead, the consequences simply became more visible, with his reputation and career suffering accordingly. Once the studio stopped fixing his problems, the public finally began to see glimpses of the real Mickey Rooney, observed a film critic who covered that era. The gambling debts, the failed marriages, the erratic behavior, the legal troubles, all the things MGM had spent years hiding suddenly became public knowledge. The contrast between Andy Hardy and the actual Mickey Rooney couldn't have been more stark. Rooney's case represents perhaps the most comprehensive example of how studio power could completely insulate a valuable star from legal consequences, creating an environment where lawbreaking became normalized and even expected. Unlike some of our other entries whose criminal behavior eventually caught up with them, Rooney spent decades protected from any meaningful consequences for his actions.